Hello and welcome to Straight Until Disney, a Disney deep dive and analysis podcast, where each week I, your host Jonathan, takes a deep dive into the history of each Disney film and the legacy that they left behind. I'd like to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram at straightontildisneypod. Before we start this week's podcast, I'm going to start with a new segment I'm calling Mousekeeping, where I discuss some of the news that has come out in the last week. And the first thing I'm going to discuss is the breaking news that literally came out an hour before I started recording today's podcast, that beginning in summer 2026 at Disney World, you'll be able to take a fun excursion to conservation station in Disney's Animal Kingdom, where you can now play and dance with Bluey and Bingo from Bluey, and they'll be there for a meet and greet, and are also going to be popping up on the cruise lines as well. The Roman talking Christmas tree, Douglas Flair, has now arrived at Downtown Disney in California, after debuting at Walt Disney World in 2023. But this will be his first appearance in the Disneyland Resort, which I find quite interesting, and I'm not 100% sure how that tree looks. If anyone knows, please let me know, because I'm quite interested in how that looks. Soaring Across America will debut at Disney's California Adventure on July 2nd, 2026, next year, for America's 250th anniversary, so I'm guessing that'll look nice. I haven't actually looked at any of the concept art for it or how it's gonna look, so maybe it'll look quite interesting, and I'm not 100% sure how much people want this or are happy with the refurb, because I know a lot of people weren't happy when they changed the Walt Disney World version. So hopefully it'll look good and hopefully people will enjoy it, and it's a little different. We also have some other news. The Disney Parks dated 2026 collection is now available online. Rock and Roller Coaster pre-show with the Aerosmith has been permanently removed already ahead of the refurb into the Muppets, which I find quite interesting, and honestly, I expected this to happen sooner. And honestly, from the amount of vlogs I've watched and the Aerosmith pre-show doesn't work, it just makes it more hilarious. And honestly, I do think it's time something else went in there. Did I expect it to be Muppets? No. But I am quite excited, and I just want to put this in other news, the Muppets aren't leaving as much as I thought they were. So despite the fact that Muppets 3D is being torn down and the Muppet Land for Monstropolis, that's how you say it, which I will discuss in a minute because there's some updates on top of that. But in an edition of Time magazine discussing about the Muppets, Muppet Studio Vice President Lee Slaughter said that fans want some laughs and a little bit of joy from the Muppets. We're here to make the world a whole lot happier and a little weirder. Nashawari later added, to that end, fans may want to start booking their travel plans for next year because they're about to see a lot more of Kermit and Company at Disney cruise ships and theme parks, including live appearances from the characters on land and sea, and that's via Attractions magazine, which I find quite interesting, that as much as Muppet Land, but the section that was the Muppets is going, the Muppets aren't leaving the parks. And I think for a lot of people who love the Muppets and adore them, I do think that it's an interesting thing. And I think it's really interesting that today's episode is about Pinocchio, which is a puppet, and I'm talking about the Muppets, which I find quite interesting here. But I'm glad to see that we're not losing them, as I did anticipate, thinking that we're going to lose them and it'd be just this one ride. But it's really interesting that they're popping up on the cruise lines. because I don't think any of the Muppets have yet, and I was wondering how they would be incorporated. Because to be honest, the Muppets are a big part of Disney history, and when I get to the 2011 Muppets film, and potentially if I have time this Christmas, Muppets Christmas Carol, we will see. I might be able to squeeze it in, or it might come next year, just with the way pods working, getting through the films. But I do find this really, really fascinating that this is where we're at in terms of films and in terms of where we're at when it comes to Muppets in the parks. What else have we've also got the box office for Zootopia 2 over the weekend, which has blown expectations away, and I'm so happy because I'm so excited for this film. I have not yet seen it, but I will be going to see it at some point. I'm not sure just yet, just with it being so close to the holiday season and getting around it. But from it ruled Thanksgiving with a 158 million US opening, and then a record smashing 560 million globally, and that comes from Deadline, which I'm finding really interesting to see and discuss. In other news, we've got Avatar Fire and Ash merchandise has started arriving at Animal Kingdom and in online stores. I haven't looked at them specifically yet, but from what I've seen, I think some of them look quite nice and not too bad. And just before the start of the podcast, we had the reports from the first batch of critics calling it the best of the trilogy, which I find quite interesting because I haven't really been as enthralled with the second and this one. I just think I just don't know. There's so much I don't know about it, and I just think it's putting me off a little bit in terms of not being able to know what the plot really is. It looks beautifully stunning, but at the same time, I'm like, I just want some really dynamic storytelling that I feel that's what the critics were talking about, that there's some really big stuff. So I think I'm intrigued to see what they do with it, and I'm intrigued to find out what the story's gonna propel for 4 and 5. And I still can't believe we're getting Avatar 3, 4, 5. I did not expect that back in the day. In other news for construction, sand has been placed for construction of Villain's Land at the Magic Kingdom, and to say the least, this is the land I'm most excited for, and I cannot wait because it's finally time for a villains section of the Disney parks where they can just roam around like the normal characters do over in California Adventure at Walt Disney World. And I just want to side note, Jason Y. Newcast did this brilliant dissection of the villains sections that are on the Disney Destiny and how they may be hinting at what's to come for that land. So I would recommend you go check out his video discussing all that because I found it incredibly interesting and what they could be doing at Disneyland for the Villains Land. We've also got concrete being laid for the Encanto ride at Disney's Animal Kingdom. Rest in peace, dinosaur, when it does go in February. And we've also had the construction starting on Monsters Inc. Land, Monstropolis. And to say the least, I cannot wait for this ride. You have no idea how excited I am for this because as much as I adore a lot of the other films, Pixar's where I grew up. I grew up with Monsters Inc. a lot. And I've always thought, why is there not a roller coaster based on that end scene where they're chasing through the doors and now it's happening and it's gonna be reality? Is kind of wild to me. And I'm just really, really excited to see what they do with it and how it comes to life. And I didn't know this from the concept art because I'm not very good at being able to see things on concept art. But we have confirmation. The restaurant will be Harryhausen's, which I'm so excited for that scene. If they're not playing "Put That Child Back where it came from. So help me at parts of the land there will be thing, and I want a Roz meet and greet. I might do just a bonus podcast talking about what I would love to see in these lands and how that might be something I might do is just talk about, and maybe even you could send in what you would like to see in these lands that are coming and what is, because I'm really, really excited for them. I think they're going to bring some new life into these parks in a way that I don't think some of the old attractions have been doing recently. And I do think, imagine Villain's Land when we get to Halloween, when it's officially open. How beautiful. Yeah, round the back of Haunted Mansion. I'm very, very excited for these things that are coming. And I'm very intrigued to see what they do with them and how they execute them. And I'm intrigued to see what we'll get at D23 next year. I have plans to do a D23 prediction video and maybe just predictions for 2026 in general. And we'll go through it in the new year. We'll have a yearly review of what's to come. I also have plans to do a box office projections video, well, not video, podcast at the beginning of next year, where I dig deep into how the year 2025 has been profitably in terms of films, what's worked, what hasn't worked, how, from a media point of view, which I find really interesting to think about. You know, and they say, well, where is Disney now? And what can we expect from 2026 in terms of Disney on the big screen and on Disney Plus as well, which I find really interesting. I believe that's all the news this week I've found. I'd just like to say the news that I've come from Walt Disney World News Today. I don't know what I would do without that app, and I'm so glad I've managed to find the app back on my phone because it wasn't working. But thank you to you people who keep going with that, because it's a real godsend, that app, being able to really dissect and understand what's going on in the Disney parks and all the news that's happened. And yeah, so this will be a new segment each week, Mousekeeping, where we'll go dissect the news, see what's happened across all the parks, interestingly. And so today's podcast is Disney Classic number 2, Pinocchio. And in all honesty, I'm not a huge fan. Maybe I did find it a little bit boring. I just don't know. There was something missing that I felt with Snow White. This real beauty, this heart, this warmth that I just didn't get with Pinocchio. I thought it was just a bit like, eh, it's there. And I don't know why I felt that way. I do think it was a bit uh, some action. I just think not a lot happens in it. In genuine speaking, in terms of action, in propelling the story forward. And I'll talk about it when I get to the plot. But I do think there's a bit of it where I'm just like, so this happens. Okay. Oh, this happens. There's big story beats throughout it, and I think the thing that makes this film beautiful is its internal message of being selfless, brave, and true, and the idea of temptation is a really big theme within this in the narrative, and I quite enjoy it. I think from a story point of view, in terms of what they wanted to execute, I think is done beautifully. I just think some of the story beats are a bit boring. Maybe it's just my luck because I'm used to big blockbusters. I'm from that era of film after film after film in terms of having this big narrative. So maybe it is just me being, I want more. I want more from it. So that just makes it a bit more dynamic, a bit more interesting. That's not to say it's not a beautiful film, and it's quite lovely. But I was a bit like, really? I'm kind of a bit not vibing with it, and I don't know why that is. I just think Snow White had this beautiful story, and I think it's because I've grown up with Disney lore. Maybe it's because I've grew up more with those Brothers Grimm darker tales and all these lovely things that I am like, Pinocchio, it's a nice story, but I'm just not I just didn't vibe with it, and I'm not sure what that is and why that is with it. And that's not to say it's a bad film, but I'm a bit like, it's an alright film, does its job, made a lot of money at the box office, which I'll get into, but I'm just like, I think they could have been done. I think what it is that there's no build up in this film in terms of. I think Pleasure Island could have been darker. I think you could have seen Geppetto leave with Figaro. You could. There was a bit more oomph missing that made some of the more emotional beats later on in the film feel a bit flatter because you didn't have that build up. You didn't. You don't get to see the wedge driven a bit. I think the villains could have been a bit more manipulative. I just think there's something missing in that middle act that could have really propelled it into being a bit more dramatic, a bit more give it that action that they wanted with the monstro section. But then again, I do think it probably is down to the monstro section that I found interestingly here reading is what drove Disney to go, actually, no, I can see potential in this. And I do think that's a really interesting thing that I'll discuss in a moment when I get to it. That I found, so even you weren't as sold on it till you saw this section. And I can understand why, because it does feel like the first two acts, there's not a lot going on. And I do think things could have been maybe added or could have just been heightened a bit more to create this more dramatic feeling, this more propelled story of a father and a son, and the idea of temptation and being selfless, brave, and true. And I do think it could have just been a bit more added in terms of layers and get into this beautiful narrative story. I do think Pleasure Island should have had a bit more of a darker atmospheric to it. And I just think there's just something missing in those sections that just really hits home the ending. And that's my real overall thoughts about it. So, Pinocchio was directed by Ben Sharpstein, who was the supervising director, Hamilton Lusk, who was also a supervising director, Bill Roberts, Norman Ferguson, Jack Kinney, Wilfred Jackson, and T. He. The film was produced by Walt Disney. The story was by Ted Sears, Otto Engelander, Webb Smith, William Cottrell, Joseph Sabo, Erdman Penner, Aurelius Battaliga. The film stars Cliff Edwards, Dickie Jones, Christian Rubb, Mel Blanc, Walter Catalet, Charles Judas, Evelyn Venable, Frankie Darrow, Florence Nash. Music was by Lee Harlin, Ned Washington, Paul J. Smith. Studio was Walt Disney Productions, as with all films. The distributor was PRKO Radio Pictures. The film was released February 7th, 1940, and that was the New York City premiere, and then was released generally on February 23rd, 1940. The film has a runtime of 88 minutes, and its budget was 2.6 million, and its gross revenue was 121 billion 892,045 million. I'm sure you can be able to work out what that is, because I'm not the greatest with maths, as I know myself, and I'm not the great at knowing what that number is. So Pinocchio is a 1940 American animated fantasy musical film and was produced by Walt Disney Pictures Productions and released by RKO Radio Productions. As mentioned, this is the second feature film produced and released by Disney animated canon in the Disney animated canon. The film is based on Carlo Collaldi's 1883 children's novel Le avventure de Pinocchio, storia de un burattino. The plot centers on Pinocchio, a wooden puppet that is brought to life by a fairy to fulfill the wish of its creator and fatherly figure, Geppetto. Guided by his conscience in the person of a cricket named Jiminy Cricket, Pinocchio tries to earn his right to become a real boy while facing the challenges and dangers of a hostile world filled with crooks, villains, and monsters. The film was made in response to the worldwide success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and as mentioned, premiered on February 7th in New York City and in Los Angeles 2 days later. The film has been theatrically released in 1945, 1954, 1962, 1971, 1978, 1984, and 1992 have been its re-releases in the cinema. The song When You Wish Upon a Star would become a major hit and now is still identified with the film universally and is also universally known as the intro to every Disney film, as the intro to the Walt Disney Studios Pictures logo that gives us all the chills. And we all know it from that. Pinocchio also won best two Academy Awards for Best Original Song and Best Original Score. The film has been deemed culturally significant by the Library of Congress in 1994 and thus was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry. In 2008, the American Film Institute's top 10 animated feature films of all time listed Pinocchio and ranked only behind Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In the decades since its release, the film has been widely considered by many film historians, critics, and pundits to be one of the greatest animated motion pictures ever made. And I agree with it to an extent. I agree that it's beautifully crafted, just like Snow White. But I think it falls a bit more flat in story, to my opinion, to Snow White. I think there's more going on in Snow White than there is in Pinocchio. In the first two acts, the third act really ramps it up, and I just wish Act 1 and Act 2 of this film added some emphasis to that and added a bit more depth into it that really made you pull on the heartstrings. So, production history. So Walt Disney had been aware of Pinocchio for a long time, and we have a recollection here from Roy E. Disney himself of his uncle reading the story to him before bed. However, he never really seemed to consider the film for a feature, which I find interesting, and also it really shows, I think, as real much in this film as to he didn't really have high expectations for the story as a feature film, and I do wonder why that is. And if he was alive today, I would love to understand where he came from that. And I think that's a real fascinating thing. And it was never considered until it was suggested by Ben Sharpstein, who was a supervising director on the film. A family friend, Mrs. K. Evers, suggested for a short subject in a letter of April 8th, 1935. So, this is where things ramp up. In 1935, Disney was on a holiday in Europe. And he met a man called Lo Duca, who was an Italian journalist, who was similarly enthusiastic that Disney adapt Pinocchio as a feature film. And I find that really interesting. There was all these people saying, you really should do it. And I do find that interesting, fabulously, as to why we did that. It's a real interesting thing to think about in terms of film. That all these people were telling him, you should do this. And he took a risk again. And I do find that really fascinating. So he said, Laduca said that it was fit to be developed in a letter. So in May 1934, the title of Pinocchio was registered for a feature. So Collodi's original story, which I'm not gonna butcher the pronunciation again, was first appeared in serial form in 1881, sorry, and then was published as a book in 1883. The first English translation of the story was published in America in 1911. However, Walt Disney owned the original Italian version, which is what the film is primarily based upon, and several different English translations of the tale. And in 1937, Bianca Malot, who was a member of the story department, made a new translation. A play by Yasha Frank, which was based on the original story, was published in 1939, but performed earlier. Disney would then circulated a memo on June 9th, 1937, recommending that his artists will see the play and consider it as material for the feature. However, 1937 is the year that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was released, and so, due to the pressure to complete the film, story meetings for Pinocchio did not continue to happen till March 24th, 1938. Sorry. Story work for Bambi had already begun in 1937, which I find so fascinating that we'd already started thinking about the future of Disney. We'd already started thinking about what came next. And I find it really interesting that we're looking at Bambi here, because Bambi's number 5. So we'd already doesn't seem to be any work here on Fantasia or Dumbo, to my knowledge, from what I've seen here. But Bambi was in that early stages in 1937, which I find fascinating. And that was before the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. There's a bit of an answer here. So what the thinking behind that was that an animal characters of Bambi would be easier to animate, as we found out last week with the fact that the prince, a male character, was really hard to animate for the film, and thus a lot of his story was cut out. So I do find it interesting here that that's why you don't really see this till the 50s really, and the late of the first era with Ichabod and Mr. Toad, of human people in these films. And Disney expected Disney actually expected Bambi to be made first and finished first, and because it would be far easier to animate than the cast of Pinocchio. So I find it really interesting that in another universe, Bambi was going to be number 2, and we would have been traumatized even earlier as children. Trust me, I can't wait to rewatch that scene when we get to Bambi. It is also thought that Walt showed less enthusiasm in the story meetings for Pinocchio than in those for Snow White. And I really think that's because Snow White was his child. Snow White was his big vision. And I think it's understandable that in these pitch meetings it was a bit because it wasn't something he was interested in. Snow White was this beautiful story that he had sat there and went, I want to do this, 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 this. I want the Queen to be this. And I find that really fascinating that he had this big bold idea for what he wanted Snow White to be, but he was so really less enthusiastic when it comes to Pinocchio. And I understand that really in terms of Snow White was his baby. In terms of creating a story, creating a film, it was what he really wanted to do, and he pushed boundaries for that film. And it was now like, what do we do next? And I'm not sure if it would be possible. And thus he was anxious to increase the output of his studio, as he intended at this point to release, in addition to short short cartoons, as he had been doing for a long time, 2 or more features every year. Interesting that we're already starting to think about having more than one film released per year. However, Disney has started not doing that again. You only really see Disney release two. Disney's only ever really released 2 Disney animated films. 2016 comes to mind with Zootopia and Moana, because they tend to release the Walt Disney Studios animated film for Thanksgiving, which is kind of a very big genius move, and it does mean you get people in the cinemas because families are together. It's quite an interesting thing to look at from a demographic and consumer point of view, in that's really the window where you see. What they tend to do is they release the Pixar film in the summer, and you get your Disney animated film in the summer, in the fall, in that Thanksgiving weekend area. Can't think if there's been another instance for a while that they've done 2 back to back, other than pandemic times, where they had. Well, that's Pixar had Luca turning red. They pumped them all out together, really. So there's that interesting aspect to think about. But I don't think they have done since. Well, I think it's because one of them, because they didn't have they didn't have a Pixar, not a Pixar film, a animated feature film released in 2015 from memory, because of there was something happening with the animated studios at the time, if I'm remembering correctly, because Pixar had the similar thing with Inside Out and Good Dinosaur, because Good Dinosaur was meant to come out in 2014, but the animation wasn't ready, so they pushed it back. So there was no Pixar film in 2014, hence why there was 2 in 2015. I'm not sure why Cars 3 Coco came out the same year. I think it was an interesting thing, because, to be fair, Cars 3 was a cash grab, and I'll discuss that when I get to the Pixar films. But I just find it interesting that they tend to do that, and they're already thinking about the idea of having multiple films released each year, which I find incredibly fascinating. And thus, interestingly, we get these films. As a result, the story was split into sections, and maybe this is where that idea of the film not feeling as organic as Snow White maybe comes into play a bit. The first consisting of scenes introducing Pinocchio, Geppetto, Figaro, and the Blue Fairy was prepared in a scene-by-scene format. Animators began in early 1938. It was not until February of that year that Disney began to show more interest, finding potential in the scenes featuring Monstro the Whale. So the big dramatic ending scenes, big plot of Act 3, is where the interest grew. And I find that really interesting, fascinating, because I think that's where I paid the most attention to, because it's the big dramatic climax of the film. And everything else just... I think the other thing is, I think it has a villain problem. Because you have Honest John, Gideon, Strombo, and Monstro. I don't think the film knows who's its main villain. And maybe that's a bit part of why I'm like, I'm not too sure what I'm really watching here, because it feels like 3 different stories all playing into one. And I think maybe that is why it feels a little less just disjointed than that of Snow White, because we had one main villain. That's not to say you can't have one or more villains. I just wonder if that might be why it feels a bit disjointed, in my opinion. Who knows? Maybe I'm just looking into it. So the story men found that Collodi's original story was difficult to adapt, as it was originally written in serial form. The story, as a result, here we go, episodic. So that's probably why I do think it does feel like 3 different stories merged into one. And it maybe could have worked better if we're looking at it now. It could have worked better as a six episode Disney Plus series. You never know. If we were thinking back then, it might have worked better here, and you wouldn't have felt the organicness. It's still a beautiful film. But it is interesting to think if they had that option, maybe it could have worked that way. Maybe it could have worked like the animated shows we got in the 90s, which is really interesting to think about, and thus needed to be cut down considerably in order to work as a feature film. The primary problem, however, was its protagonist, because Pinocchio himself was an imprudent rogue, often guilty of cruelty in the original story. His wooden body would surely make the character even less sympathetic with audiences in early story treatments for the film. And thus, Pinocchio retains his malice, at one point trapping Figaro's tail in a vice. Emphasis would have to be placed on the boy's wooden body, as he was teased for his appearance by boys and sniffed at by the curious dog on the way to school. As animation had by this time begun, but no voice had yet been found, animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston worked from the sped up voice of storyman Ted Sears, intended as a temporary measure. However, Disney was unhappy with the character of Pinocchio and halted production until a solution could be found. The degree of humanity in the living puppet had yet to be determined and fine tuned. And thus, in early April 1938, however, scenes featuring other characters had been written and were being animated. So I find it really interesting. There was, as much as I find an antagonist problem, there was a protagonist problem, because they wanted the protagonist to be likable and for audience to feel sympathy for a character that really had no sympathy and was really unlikable. And I think we found that balance now of being able to create unlikable characters that we love to hate, but still find real sympathy for them, especially with Disney villains, as we've found, and characters that are really more nuanced and complex and dynamic. But it's a real interesting thing to think about, that they were struggling to find this. And when I dive deeper into the development of character in a bit, I found this really interesting, how dynamic these were. Although Fred Mirror had attempted to design Pinocchio in a more healing way, it was Miltka, who had worked on Snow White, who was responsible for the character redesign that we know and love today, as he approached the character as though he was an ordinary boy rather than a wooden puppet. The joints and bolt nails could simply be drawn in afterward. At the request of Lusk, Hamilton Lusk, Carl illustrated his ideas by animating the scene in which Pinocchio dives into the sea in search of Monstro. The little wooden boy became less mischievous and more passive, wandering innocently into the hostile world that awaited him. Though Disney himself found this to be an excellent idea, given the go-ahead for the opening scene's animation to be continued in September. Some were unsure, including Wilfred Jackson, who would later admit that the change removed the guts of the whole story, as a more human Pinocchio in his puppet form made his transformation into a real boy less gratifying. And I do wonder if that's a real. It's another bit of the story that I think's missing, that gut punch. And even they're saying here that they found that here as well. And I do find it incredibly interesting and unique to think about in terms of characterization and drawing. So the Disney studio debated about including a winter scene or full-fledged scene featuring Christmas in the animated feature. I'm kind of glad there isn't one, because I was already thinking it was 3 different shows in one. And honestly, I think it could have worked more as a silly symphony, to be honest. So adding another one would have made it feel full. And I think that was because they were looking at a winter release. From a January 6, 1938 story meeting, Walt Disney said, "That's the trouble. The exhibitors will class it as a Christmas picture and only run it at Christmas time. Well, Heidi had Christmas in it. They had quite a sequence there at Christmas. It doesn't matter. We were just trying to get something pictorial in here." And I understand that, because to be fair, Christmas is a beautiful sequence, and some Disney films have it. It's beautifully done in Beauty and the Beast. Well, in the snow sequence, and I think it works there. I just don't think it would have worked in this film, and I'm kind of glad there isn't a section with Christmas in it. As with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Albert Hertler designed the characters, objects, and locations featured in Pinocchio and was responsible for the overall styling of the film. Hunt's influence are particularly apparent in the scenes in Geppetto's workshop, in which nearly every object is designed to resemble a face or creature of some sort, which I find quite interesting, and it's really unique in creating this vibrant world. He had this such passion for even the smallest of details being this real unique story, and I really love that in terms of creation. He then realised that as a three-dimensional, often working model, however, the inspiration sketch artist whose style is perhaps most prevalent in the final film was a Gustav Hengerera, who had already made his name as an illustrator before joining the studio in 1936. He reinforced the influence of European illustration on the film, having worked as successor to John Bauer for the magazine Bland Pama ou Clos. He also kept files and cuttings on favourite American painters such as Thomas Hart, Benton, Grant Wood, and Edward Hopper, and shots from Hollywood films. And you can really feel that. You can see this real influence of European world and how these paintings, because it is a beautiful visually film. I just think there's a bit of story missing, and ultimately, in terms of creating this unique and vast story, it just there's just something missing. And I know I keep harping on about it, but it just feels like the story could have been so much more dynamic and structurally telling. Another person who worked on the film was Joe Grant, and who had designed both the Evil Queen and her alter ego, the Witch, and had been responsible along with William Cottrell for both characters' scenes in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. During production of Snow White, several crude models, including animators for the dwarfs and a plastic Snow White head, had been constructed as reference for the animators. Grant's more detailed plastic model of the Witch did not go unnoticed by Walt Disney, who, when passing him in a studio hallway one day, asked him to set up a little department and think tank, which is so interesting and so cool that they wanted to create these things that could help them develop the characters in animated form and understand how to do this. And thus he was responsible for the design and construction of models for use for the animators and their assistants. Interestingly, Disney did not include Cottrell in its proposal. It is thought that separating the team of Grant and Cottrell was intended as a reassertion of Disney's power, which I find so interesting that we were already looking at two dynamic set groups within the Disney company, even back in the 40s, which I find really interesting to think about. In setting up the character model department, he recruited the studio's best artists. Over the years, the department included, among others, John P. Miller, Bob Jones, Martin Provision, Campbell Grant, John Walbridge, Finney Rudiger, Tom Kodrick, Mary Blair, Aurelius Battagley, James Bodereau, Kay Nelson, and Albert Herter. Most artists would produce sketches and model sheets at Disney's suggestion, eventually three-dimensional models. And I think we'll discuss a lot more of what they did in their work as we go throughout the Disney library. And I do find it incredibly interesting that that's what we are looking at here in terms of storytelling. And it's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of storytelling. Thus, they create these things. I'm just looking for my notes. And thus, I find it really interesting that we allowed for this creation of these characters and development of this real vast world to be able to understand how to animate. And I think that process is such an interesting and cool thing to think about in terms of character and development, and thus really allowing for this unique and passionate world building. And I do think it's a real interesting thing to think about in terms of character. So upon its 1940 release, Pinocchio was not financially successful, which I can understand, and that obviously was mainly due to World War II, cutting off European and Asian markets overseas. However, others think it was too dark for being a film for families audiences, while there was also clear dark elements. I don't think it's dark enough. I think they could have gone a bit more further in highlighting the idea of temptation and creating a much more villainous thing. But then again, that's my opinion. I do think there's certain elements that could have been done better. I think it's a bit mad in thinking that you don't get to see the comeuppance of the villains. It's all off screen, and I think it would have been better if they'd shown it. But that's because it does feel like three different films in one. Personally, when watching it, I'm just a bit like, yeah, I don't understand. And I know they had plans to do stuff, and I do think it's a really interesting thing. However, despite not being initially a commercial success and financial success, the film remains one of the most critically acclaimed of all the Disney animated features, which I find quite interesting and unique to think about. So, we're now finally at the plot of the film, which I'm going to briefly summarise, because I know this is already going to be a longer episode than last week's, because I found so much more interesting and unique things to talk about, and I find it so fascinating that we're able to discuss the workings of how Disney created these films. So the film opens with Jiminy Cricket, who narrates the film, and along, and obviously we also get the infamous "When You Wish Upon a Star" played throughout as he sits on a bookshelf. On the bookshelf, as Snow White did, that I forgot to mention, we get a bit of hint of what Disney might do in the future, because on the bookshelf there's Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, both that would be released in the 1950s and would be classic number 13 and classic number 14, which I find so fascinating. The reason why I completely forgot to mention this in Snow White is that there's a sequence where dwarfs go, is she a witch? Is it a dragon with horns? Obviously, indirectly thinking about Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty. And there's also one where they go off with their heads, obviously the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland, which I find so interesting that they ironically and inadvertently already thinking about what they might do in the future and what they could think about. And after the song, Jiminy then greets the audience and acknowledges that they may not believe that a wish or a song states that may come true. And that's really a big theme of this film, is that dreams can come true a bit, and like if you wish on the star. We then get to Pinocchio's village, and we get to meet Geppetto, Figaro, and he's working on wood because that's what he does for a living. And he wishes to have a son. He really wishes that he has a son, and by wishing on a blue star, the blue fairy makes Pinocchio a real boy in terms. And in terms of that, we get this beautiful sequence of this real interesting, unique storytelling, and that wishing on the blue star. Well, so the star glows brighter, and coming to life, we get the blue fairy introduced into the film. And the blue fairy doesn't play a massive part in the original source material, which I found incredibly interesting. That actually, she's not really blue, the blue fairy, and that actually Pinocchio was already magical wood, and so she didn't need to bring him to life, which I find kind of works better in this film. I think that's a positive that I found with this film. That I think that just makes that a bit more sense. Jiminy hops down to explain to Pinocchio. Blue Fairy decides to dub the cricket Pinocchio's conscience and leaves, telling Pinocchio to always let his conscience to be his guide. And we also get the infamous, you must be selfless, brave and true, or you will turn back into wood. Jiminy then tries to explain the concepts of right and wrong, the darkness of this world that he's now entered. And I find it really interesting that we delve into this idea of temptation and greed. And that's a real big thing of this film, is the idea of temptation. And I find it really fascinating that we get this fall from grace for Pinocchio and then builds himself back up. And I just think we could have dealt with that a bit more better. And I think we could have introduced that kind of side to it in a much more nuanced and interesting way. And that's not to say it's a bad thing with this film. I just think there could have been more More! So the next morning, Pinocchio goes to school and he excitedly follows the boys. However, he's approached by two cunning thieves, Fox and the Cat, who are known as Honest John and Gideon. And one of the things I find interesting actually here, we get the first Disney villain song in Pinocchio with Honest John's Hi Diddle Dee Dee, which I find really fascinating that we got in this film. It's a really interesting thing to think about. And they befriend him in an attempt intended to sell him, which I find really interesting. He's then taken to Strombo's caravan, where the puppet master, buys the wooden boy and makes him his star attraction. So he's got this fame, this glory. And I think we do deal with the seven deadly sins in this film that I think could have been executed a bit better. And I do think the live action could have done it better, but I actually haven't seen the live action Pinocchio, the Disney version, the Guillermo del Toro one. 5 stars. But I think they both came out around the same time, so I think I just was a bit Pinocchioed out at that point. And I think it's a really interesting, unique thing to think about. I think I'll discuss that at the time when I do the live action Pinocchio, because I will watch it for the podcast. And I find that far interesting to think about. And so Pinocchio is then sold. He then is then going off to Pleasure Island, which I think could have been far much more darker, and that she informs that he's not telling the truth about things, and thus we get the infamous "the nose grows if you're telling a lie." And I do find it far interesting. The blue fairy frees Pinocchio from the cage that is being placed in by Strombo and vanishes, saying that this is the last time she can help him. They then sneak out of the caravan, leaving Strombo. Thus, you don't really see what happens to all the villains, so I'm trying to just skip over it because you don't really need to think about it, really. And thus, they learn that Geppetto has gone out searching for Pinocchio and now is stuck inside Monstro the Whale, which I find incredibly interesting. As we get villain number 4, I do think it's so piled with villains that you don't really get the big story, and thus Pinocchio sacrifices himself to save Geppetto, and thus inside the belly of the whale he's rescued. Geppetto and Pinocchio reunite. They then work out a way to escape using fire, and thus now in Geppetto's workshop, Jiminy, Geppetto, and his pets mourn Pinocchio's death. However, for saving his father, Pinocchio has proven himself selfless, brave, and true, and thus the Blue Fairy grants him his wish, and he comes back to life and becomes a real boy. The donkey ears and tail are also disappear. Pinocchio shows the others that he's alive and a real boy, and thus interesting. However, an interesting thing is this is one of the few Disney movies that lacks timelessness when it comes to audio due to the fact that old 1930s language phrases aren't used in common speech anymore. Phrases such as bloke, swell joint, scrape, or hop into it are used in the film, and the most infamous example being an actor's life is gay in lyrics of Hi Diddle Dee, Hi Diddle Dee Dee. It's a tongue twister that. Back in the 1930s and up to the 50s, the word gay meant happy, and it also applies to some other language versions. So that language and the idea of interpretation really plays into this film a bit more. I find that really interesting. According to Disney and the filmmakers, Jiminy's role in the film was meant to develop the heart of the story and the friendship between him and Pinocchio. And as much as I really think that is played into, I just think it could have been a bit more nuanced and developed. And like all the characters, Geppetto, Jiminy Cricket even, went through a lot of designs. And one of the things I find really interesting is that on Snow White, Ward Kimball had animated a scene where the dwarfs were eating soup, and that got cut after spending 8 months animating the scene. And I find that incredibly disheartening. And I really like the fact that Walt realised this and decided to give him the job of designing and animating Jiminy Cricket. And I really like the interesting thing. So, if we look at the development of each of the characters, in the original Italian book, Pinocchio was purposely portrayed a bit more misbehavioral and obnoxious, and the filmmakers originally stayed true to that. And once production on the adaptation begun, it resulted in a character that was more wisecracking and brazen, which is a drastically different interpretation to what we get in the final film. And I do wonder what that film would have looked like, and I do wonder how that interpretation would have been seen in that time period, which I find incredibly fascinating. And obviously, they re-evaluated and restructured the film to create a much more nuanced and sympathetic character from the character. One of the things I couldn't find is there's not a lot about the development of Geppetto, so I'm going to move straight on to Jiminy Cricket, as I've just discussed a few minutes ago. The red umbrella always on his person. He was appointed his Pinocchio's official conscience. Notably for being the original performer of When You Wish Upon a Star. Jiminy has appeared alongside Mickey Mouse and Tinkerbell as company mascot throughout the years. So, we're just gonna go to the Blue Fairy now because I think it's a real interesting thing to have a look at Jiminy Cricket because there's a real lot in development of how he became the cricket we loved. So the Blue Fairy was to give the appearance of loveliness I find interesting and thus a glamorous girl. And early model sheets and inspirations depict this ethereal beauty, which I find fascinating, especially with the 40s at the time. We're looking at this idea of beauty, and I do think, to be fair, the Blue Fairy, she's there. She doesn't do a lot. She comes in, makes him a real boy, tells him what not to do. He does what she doesn't tell him to do. Goes, you've got a final warning. Flies back and goes, you've finally decided to be selfless, brave and true. You're now a real boy. And that's her role in the film, which I find fascinating. And thus, I do find it incredibly interesting and unique to think about with this film. And that is what we're really looking at when it comes to Pinocchio. So, we're going to now look at the legacy of the film. And where we're looking at with the parts now, which I find incredibly interesting. So, Pinocchio, like Snow White, has appeared in many forms. As I've mentioned, I've just talked about the live action. I haven't watched it. I will watch it at some point. But unlike Snow White, I think it's because it went straight to Disney Plus that I'm like, I'll get around to it. Never got around to it. Pinocchio, Geppetto, and Blue Fairy, and Jiminy Cricket are all major players in the first season of Once Upon a Time, and continue to appear across the entirety of the season in lesser roles than they were in the first season, and thus I know more about it from that story aspect in terms of live action appearances. Pinocchio's appeared in, as most of the characters have, in House of the Mouse shorts. They've also appeared and have a Pinocchio, Geppetto, Blue Fairy, and Pinocchio, Geppetto, Blue Fairy, and Jiminy Cricket, all appear in Kingdom Hearts in the video game, and Jiminy Cricket and Pinocchio have very big roles in those stories, and thus create this unique story